Welcome back to Alberta Unfiltered, Michael. This is Dr. Wagner, and he is, I'm going to dub him, the official professor of Alberta independence.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here.
It's just an absolute pleasure. Michael has been going around Alberta speaking about not only the whys, but the hows of separation. And so we're going to talk a bit about that today. In our last interview, I had not yet had a chance to read Time to Leave. And I've obviously read it, and I've made a lot of notes. And I have to say, your writing style is wonderful to read. Anybody can read this book. It's smooth, the printing is large enough, your sentences are simple. In this book, you have so many concepts. There's history I didn't know that anybody who's a semi-history buff would find so interesting about Alberta politics. Where can people find this book?
Actually, perhaps the best place to get it is a website for a business based in Didsbury called Merchantship. So the website is merchantship.ca. So I can search my last name there and my books will come up, including that one. It's also available on Amazon, but for some reason it's not directly from Amazon, it's through third-party sellers. So it's a little bit more expensive that way, but you can order it from Amazon. But merchantship.ca is where I recommend people get it.
Thank you. Why did you write this next book?
Actually, the reason I wrote that was because previously in 2021, I'd written a book called No Other Options, Self-Determination for Alberta.
Yes.
And that's where I explained what I believe to be the best case for Alberta independence. People should read that and be convinced of Alberta independence. And there were people who, after they read that, said, yes, I'm convinced that Alberta should become independent, but first we need to try one more thing to reform Canada, and only if that fails should we become independent.
What was that one thing?
Well, different people had different suggestions, but most of them had to do with some aspect of constitutional reform.
Okay.
When I heard that argument, it would frustrate me because I know we have been doing these various reform attempts for several decades. None of them have succeeded. They've all failed.
Sure.
So I wanted to put together this book to explain in detail, for example, the Senate reform idea, which goes back to the late 1970s. And for decades, Westerners, and especially Albertans, have been trying different things to reform the Senate, leading up to Stephen Harper as Prime Minister even taking actions to reform the Senate. So Albertans have worked hard for several decades to reform the Senate. It was not possible to reform it. And so if we can't get Senate reform even under a Prime Minister like Stephen Harper, it's clear that we're not going to get any kind of constitutional changes that will benefit our province. So I wanted to detail for people that, the actions that Albertans have taken over several decades to try and fix Canada. We've tried to fix Canada at different ways, at different times,
yes.
And Canada does not want to be fixed. And so it's time to leave. That's time.
When you say Canada doesn't want to be fixed, I think we need some clarification there. Alberta wants Canada to be fixed. Does Saskatchewan want Canada to be fixed?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, the three prairie provinces the most, like Alberta stands out the most, but nowadays Saskatchewan would like a lot of reforms in Canada as well. And I think historically Manitoba and BC at various times have wanted reforms to the Senate. Yes. So it has been Western Canada. When I say Canada, I should be saying Central Canada, yes. Because in Western Canada, we've had these different reform movements over time, mostly in Alberta, but somewhat in the other provinces. But yeah, it's not the entire country that wouldn't be reformed, because of course we're part of that country. Yeah. But Central Canada does not want to reform things because that would mean they'd be losing power compared to what they have right now. Why would they give up power when they don't have to? What
I've learned through reading your books, and also learning about the 1905 period, is that right from the beginning, in 1905, when Alberta became a province, there were people saying, don't do it. Alberta will always be a colony within a colony. Has that happened? Has there ever been a time where Alberta was a general partner in Canada?
Well, not really. Like, there's always been discontent here right from the very beginning, as you mentioned. And in fact, I think I mentioned in there an MLA named Alwyn Bramley Moore, who wrote a book in 1915 already advocating for Alberta to pull out, not to stay an independent country, but to pull out and renegotiate its terms back into Canada, because he was concerned, like, the three prairie provinces in the beginning did not receive ownership of their natural resources like other provinces did. So the three prairie provinces were not equal until 1930, when they received the control of their own natural resources.
Or property.
Yeah, property and those kinds of things that the federal government maintained control of. So the three prairie provinces were discriminated against in terms compared to the other provinces until 1930. And so Bramley Moore was saying, Alberta, we're not getting the money that we deserve from our resources, so we need to pull out to become independent and renegotiate our way into Canada, where we have control of our resources, and then we'd have the proper income for maintaining our government. But so that was one of the areas of discontent. There was also, farmers who were discontent with their situation within Canada because they had to pay extra costs for shipping, and they had to sell their grain through middlemen. Also, there was a protective tariff. Back in those days, Central Canada was very in favor of tariffs to protect, Central Canadian industries, so that farmers would have to buy their farming equipment from Ontario and Quebec at higher prices than they should have. So these kinds of things kept people on the prairies upset with their status within Canada. And so they would often form alternative parties. They would turn away from the mainstream parties. And especially in Alberta, we had a government of the United Farmers of Alberta in the 1920s and into the 1930s. And at the federal level, we had the Progressive Party of Canada during the 1920s. And most of all, we had the Social Credit Party that came to power in Alberta in 1935 and remained in power until 1971. These were parties, that were formed in the West and based in the West because we felt we needed our own political parties to represent our interests. And these were aspects of Western discontent with Central Canada. But it's important to note that with all these different reform movements and all these alternative parties, up to about 1970 under Pierre Trudeau, there was no actual organizations that would promote Western independence. Like Westerners at that time, they felt very loyal to Canada. And they didn't begin to actually seriously talk about Western independence until Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. And I might have mentioned previously in a different discussion how I consider Pierre Trudeau to be the father of the Alberta separatist movement, because it was because of him, his policies drove people to think that way. Yeah. We have to remember, it's the federal government that's causing these things. Alberta never did anything to cause the federal government to attack us. It's always been at the initiative of the federal government. Alberta has always been in a defensive position, not an offensive position. And so we've turned to looking at independence as a way of defending ourselves from our own government.
That's an interesting psychological perspective. Central Canada actually expects us to just keep taking and taking it.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I don't understand how they think that they can continue to abuse us and we're going to do nothing about it. Yes. They think we're upset because we lost one election in, this year. And there's so much more to it than that. This goes back several decades. That election is kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back for many people. Some of us, we were fed up previous to that, but for many people that opened their eyes to the fact that we've been, abused by Central Canada and by the federal government for several decades, and we've been trying to make changes, as I mentioned, and those changes would never be implemented because it means Central Canada losing power. And so people have been very upset, with Central Canada and the federal government since at least the time of Pierre Trudeau. That's when things really started moving. It hasn't been consistent support for separatism since that time. It's come up and down since that time, but Pierre Trudeau created it, and his policies, especially the National Energy Program, gave it credibility, because it was because of the National Energy Program that that the support for independence in Alberta went from being just a single-digit support to double-digit support since that time. We might have talked about that previously.
When was a single-digit support?
Like up until 1980, I think the surveys done before 1980 showed just single-digit support for independence for Alberta and Western Canada. Yes. But since about 1980, whenever there's surveys done on support for independence in Alberta, at least, it's usually the double digits, and in recent decades, often 20 to 25%. So it's Pierre Trudeau who not only created the movement, in the 70s, but gave it credibility with his policies, especially the National Energy Program in 1980. So he definitely, it's the actions of the federal government that have created this situation.
Yes. Now, I found it really interesting in your introduction. You've indicated that the area we live in was part of what's called Rupert's land and was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company for 200 years, 1670 to 1870. We think that this is the way it's always been, that there were 200 years in there. It was a fur trading company, and it was a dictatorship then.
Yeah, I mean, it was operated just by the company, and it was not a democracy here. We think of some of the early settlements, like Fort Edmonton, right, was a fur trading settlement that became Edmonton the city. So it was operated by the company, and there were people living here, and especially in the area of, what's in the Winnipeg area now, there was settlements there. People began to do farming under the Hudson's Bay Company. So by the time Canada took it over in 1870, people already had their own lands and their farms there. Yes. And they were annexed to Canada, without being consulted, like kind of just purchased the territory and annexed it. And there were people there with different ideas about what their political future should be, whether it be independence or joining the United States or whatever. And they were not consulted. Suddenly they found out they were part of a new country. And so that kind of lack of consultation contributed to the first Riel Rebellion of 1869.
Let's talk about the Riel Rebellion, because at that point in time, the First Nations people were living together with the white settlers, the European settlers, and they were getting married, having babies, and just getting along fine. They were Métis, and Riel was a Métis.
Yes.
And apparently, according to you, there were lots of guns around, and those Métis rose up around that time you're speaking of. And because of that uprising, well, unfortunately, Riel lost his life, but that's how Manitoba came to be.
That's right. Like Manitoba was formed as a result of the first Riel Rebellion. It would actually be a few years later when Riel would be executed, because there was a second Riel Rebellion in 1885. So after this first one, I think he ended up in exile in the United States for a while. But the key thing was that Manitoba did result from that first Riel Rebellion, the creation of Manitoba in 1870.
Well, those Métis were sure tough folks.
That's right. I mean, they weren't just going to take it. I mean, Canada sent a governor out there and saying, "Oh, I'm your new governor," and they were like, "Oh, I don't think so." We don't remember that.
Exactly. So the divide that was between, the divide that's between our First Nations people and non-First Nations right now is artificial, because back in the time frame of Louis Riel, everybody was getting along quite well. They're intermarrying. Children were growing up together. Is that fair to say?
As far as I understand, yes. I mean, that community seemed like a unified community in terms of their resistance to the federal government sending out, a governor to them.
Yes. You've noted in the introduction that the white settlers and the Métis wanted self-determination. And instead, they've got dictatorship from the East.
That's the way it would have turned out. But yeah, they ended up in a sense getting self-determination with Manitoba, but that was because they resisted. It was because they resisted that they got a better political settlement than they had otherwise. Although, as I mentioned earlier, even Manitoba was not treated as an equal province because it didn't receive its natural ownership of its natural resources at that time.
Right. And you just mentioned also Alwyn Brandon Moore.
Moore, yeah.
Alwyn Branley Moore. And he began to speak out about 10 years after Alberta was formed in 1905, but it took till 1930 for changes to be made. So he advocated for a long time. This is an example of how one man can change the course of history.
Yeah, he was certainly advocating for that position early on, but as I understand, he actually passed away in the First World War. He actually went and served overseas, and I think he might have been the first serving Alberta MLA ever to die in a military conflict.
Is that right?
Something like that anyway, yeah.
Well, we have to tip our hats to him.
Absolutely.
In 1984, Prime Minister John Turner was elected, and he made a move so that provincial oil royalties no longer were deductible for federal tax purposes. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, actually, I think that was a proposal originally.
Okay.
That they wouldn't be able to deduct the royalties from their tax, which would dramatically increase the oil company's revenue. But I think they actually decided not to proceed with that in the 1974 budget. But what they did keep in the export tax on oil. Like the export tax on oil was originally imposed in 1973.
Okay.
When they brought the budget in 1974, Alberta was watching to see if they would remove that. And they did not remove the export tax on oil. And so, Peter Lougheed, our premier, called it like the biggest ripoff of a province in Confederation's history, because it was so unprecedented and it resulted in so much of revenue that Alberta deserved going to the federal government in central Canada instead.
You speak very highly of Peter Lougheed in your book. You indicate that he made this statement such that the concept of taxing the resources of Alberta will destroy Confederation. It's a very strong statement. He predicted the breaking apart of a Confederation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, he saw that the federal government was, attacking Alberta in that way.
Yes.
It was taking things from Alberta that it did not deserve.
Yes.
So it was breaking the contract of Confederation, right? With Confederation, the provinces have certain areas of jurisdiction and the federal government has certain areas of jurisdiction, and that's how the federal system works.
Yes.
But by the federal government reaching into Alberta and taking resources that Alberta owns, that's breaking the Constitution, that's breaking the Confederation deal.
Yes.
And so if the federal government's going to take powers it does not deserve and does not legally have, then that's breaking the bargain of Confederation, and it can only lead in one direction, which is to break up the country.
And that's Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution of Canada.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that was broken. Now, can you talk a bit about the oil export tax?
Yeah, like that's what I mentioned a bit previously, that it was an unprecedented act for the federal government to tax an export of provincial resources. So that led to considerable revenue of that Alberta deserved, the selling of our resources. Alberta should have received that, and the federal government would take that, and then the federal government would use that revenue to subsidize imports from other countries into Eastern Canada, so that Eastern Canada would not have to pay the full price for gasoline. They kept the price low. As I mentioned earlier, there was a Canadian price of oil set by the federal government, which was much lower than the world price. So when Alberta oil was sold within Canada, Alberta did not receive the revenue it should have received. Also, with the export tax, Alberta did not receive the money it should have received from export, not all of the money it should have received from exporting oil to the United States. And that extra revenue that the federal government would take would be used to subsidize oil imports from other countries in order to keep the price of gasoline low for central Canadian consumers.
Sure.
So we were losing both ways, whether we were selling our oil to them, we were selling at low prices to keep their gas prices low. When we sold to the United States, the extra revenue that the federal government would take would be used to subsidize oil imports into Eastern Canada to keep the price of gas low there. So Alberta was losing out in both senses.
Right. In about 1974, Albertans began to organize. And you've indicated there's a group called Independent Alberta Association. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the Independent Alberta Association was the first, really respectable separatist organization for Alberta. And it was primarily comprised of oil men with some professionals. It was led by John Rudolph, who was a very well-respected oil man in the Alberta oil sector. And Milt Herodance, who is a prominent lawyer in Calgary. So they were a relatively small group, but they were prominent citizens. And what they did was they hired academics to do studies to show the benefit of Alberta independence. And one of the persons who participated in that was Warren Blackman, who was an economist at the University of Calgary.
Okay.
He was interested in Alberta independence. He was a supporter. So he would have been one of the two main academic leaders of Alberta independence in the early years, as I mentioned in there, himself as long with Dr. Ruth Gorman. So Dr. Blackman did studies showing the economic benefits to Alberta independence at that time in the 1970s.
Yes.
Now, the oil revenue at that time was lower in terms of, the billions we talk about today. It would have been lower at that time, partly because, our currency is inflated now, and also because the price of oil was actually lower then in a sense too, relative to today. But still, Alberta, he pointed out, would benefit by becoming independent even in the 1970s with the academic studies that he did. The Independent Alberta Association also hired a constitutional expert to write a document on how Alberta could become independent under Canada's constitution at that time. Okay. And so he wrote that there was something like that. Anyway, the point is that the Independent Alberta Institute, the Independent Alberta Association, was hiring academics to do important groundwork to show to people the credibility of Alberta becoming independent in the 1970s. And so they were able to do very significant work that way.
Excellent pioneers in our province.
That's right.
Then we go to Ottawa pillaging Alberta with the support of the Ontario Conservatives. Talk to us about the Ontario Conservatives, happy to pillage Alberta.
At that time, the Ontario government was a progressive conservative government under Bill Davis, Premier Bill Davis. And Bill Davis felt that Ontario had a right to Alberta's oil at low prices, and also he felt that they had a right to some of the revenue from Alberta's oil. So the Ontario Conservatives put together a document, and I can't remember the title, but proposing for the federal government to take over Alberta's oil and share the revenues with all of Canada. And so this was obviously, breaking again the deal of Confederation, because as we mentioned, the Constitution guarantees the ownership and control of resources to the provinces. And here we had one of the provinces, the government of one of the provinces, proposing that in Alberta's case, the federal government should override the Constitution and take control of Alberta's oil so that Ontario would benefit from the revenue that was coming in. Ontario thought it was unfair that Alberta would benefit from its own resources that way. And so what's striking about that was that proposal from the Ontario government was not that any of Ontario's resources would be taken over by the federal government, but just the oil resources of the West, which means in particular Alberta.
Sure.
So Peter Lougheed was enraged by that. Obviously, that was a terrible proposal, one that would break the deal of confederation. But it's surprising, when we look at that it's not just the federal government that was against us, the Pierre Trudeau. I mean, he was encouraged by even a progressive conservative government in Ontario to take extreme actions against Alberta. And some people have written that the National Energy Program was in part a reward to the Ontario Conservatives because of the way in which the National Energy Program would result in the federal government seizing so much of Alberta's oil industry and taking that revenue to share with, quote unquote, all Canadians, as they said it, by which they mean Central Canadians.
Yes. Peter Lougheed had enemies coming at him both ways.
That's right. He had enemies. Not only the federal Liberals were against him, but many progressive Conservatives within the federal party were against him as well because, they favored Central Canada, and he was standing up very strongly for Alberta.
Yes. Thank you to Peter Lougheed.
Yes.
Now, Gordon Kessler comes along. He was an oil man. He was a rodeo cowboy, and he was a God-fearing man. Now, the only thing you need to add into that is a rifleman from Southern Alberta, and that fits the Southern Alberta culture.
Absolutely. He was kind of the stereotypical Albertan,
Yes.
rodeo cowboy in the oil industry. So he was the candidate for the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta in 1982. There was a by-election in the Olds Didsbury constituency. Actually, the Social Credit MLA there, Bob Clark, had been one of the last leaders of the Social Credit Party.
Okay.
He resigned in 1981. So there had to be a by-election in that constituency. And the Western Canada Concept Party quickly organized people there to support their candidate for that by-election, but they weren't really expected to have much of a chance there. Like the Social Credit Party had been in power in that riding, I think, for over 40 years, and the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta dominated Alberta politics, and so they were the two leading parties for that particular riding. And here, out of nowhere, came the Western Canada Concept Party to win a large number of votes and to actually win that by-election with Gordon Kessler as their candidate.
That's wonderful to hear. So we really do have over and over real stand-up people in Alberta and more are coming as you describe this history. You talk about Keynesian economics. And for those of us who don't know Keynesian economics inside and out, can you just give us a little description of what Keynesian economics is?
Sure. Like the Keynesian economics is basically a statist view of economics. It's basically like I think Keynes was a British economist, and his proposal, like he wasn't an outright socialist in the sense of having government complete control of the economy, but it was still very much in that direction that the economy was something that the government could control. Like the government has levers, and it can, through debt, through borrowing money and spending, it can boost the economy. Anyway, his way of thinking dominated Western economics after World War II. So the government's very strongly believed that they should have a strong role in the economy, like guiding which industries should survive and that kind of thing.
Okay.
It was very much a very strong role for the government in the economy, and kind of socialistic, like not pure socialism, but very much in that direction. And that really dominated Western thinking up until the time of Reagan and Thatcher, President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher. So as I mentioned there was a book written about the Calgary oil industry. It came out about 1980, called "The Last of the Free Enterprisers," because it was believed that like the Calgary oil community was very much in favor of free enterprise.
Right.
And so they were considered to be the last of the free enterprisers because they were the last holdout against the idea that the government should be controlling the economy.
So you pronounce it Keynesian.
Yes.
And that's the proper way, not Keynesian.
I think so. I think his name was Keynes, and I think
Keynes. Okay. Yeah. All right. What is populism?
Populism is kind of a general idea that a political movement that supports the best interests of the people as opposed to an elite. So historically, populism in North America goes back at least to the 1800s, where especially in the West, especially rural, new settled communities and farming communities, where people generally have the same political interests, the same economic interests. Like if you have a large area of farmers, say on the prairies in Western Canada, they have essentially the same economic interests in terms of the need to raise and sell their grain. And so when the federal government, or any government for that matter, is doing something that's against what's beneficial for the large number of people, those people will kind of create a political movement. And it's called populism because it's a mass movement of the people against the elite, against the political or economic elite. So this is what I mentioned, the United Farmers of Alberta in the 1920s. That'd be considered like a populist movement. It was, received a large amount of support from the population. Also, the Social Credit Party received, large percentages of vote from the average people. Like it wasn't supported by, the high-level politicians and academics. It was supported among the people, the common people. So populism is just generally a widely based movement among common people, like that doesn't represent the interests of the elite, whether it's a political elite or economic elite or academic elite. So it can manifest itself in different forms, both of the left wing and of the right wing. Recently, in recent decades, it's mostly been considered a movement on the right, like especially in the United States and Canada. So it's kind of a nebulous kind of concept, but it can, it's important in the sense that it represents the interests of the people against an elite. And in recent years, Donald Trump has been considered to be kind of the leader of the American populist movement. And we have something similar in Alberta. Like Alberta historically has had a strong populist sentiment. Actually, I guess I could say the prairie provinces in general have had this populist sentiment. And some of it comes from American influence because we had a lot of American immigrants coming into the Canadian prairies in the early 1900s. And so they would bring their political ideals with them. So some of our populist sentiment here in the prairies is a reflection of the American populist sentiment from the 1800s originally. Okay. And so, like I say, a lot of our political movements that were against the mainstream parties were populist movements that were kind of generic to the prairie provinces, like United Farmers of Alberta and Social Credit. In Saskatchewan, it was kind of went in the socialist direction with the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF. Okay. So, like I say, it manifests itself in different ways, but still, it's still considered to be a mass movement of the people against an elite.
Okay. Now, going back to Dr. Ruth Gorman, did you know her?
I did not know.
Oh, that's really unfortunate because she sounds like just an amazing woman. In the 1960, the First Nations people got their voting rights. 1960. And she helped them.
Right.
So there doesn't have to be this great divide between First Nations people and non-First Nations people. It's quite artificial, isn't it?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was based on, the original settlement and some of it is based on the treaties and the fact that the First Nations didn't receive the full rights of other Canadians apparently through some of those treaties, rights that perhaps they should have received, like the right to vote, for example.
Yes. She was part of the Western Concept Party?
Yeah, she was one of the founders of the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta, which was the one I mentioned that Gordon Kessler won the by-election for. And I think she also wrote a lot of their documents, and she was their lawyer because she very strongly supported Western Canada Concept because of her opposition to Pierre Trudeau and what he was trying to do to Canada's Constitution.
Sure, and one thing he did with Canada's Constitution, he took up property rights, which had been in place since the Magna Carta for 900 years. And Pierre Trudeau managed to get property rights out of Canada's charter.
Yeah, like the charter was his idea.
Yes.
It was his proposal. It was his baby that he brought in. But by leaving the property rights out, which was a deliberate act, by leaving them out, it diminishes property rights in terms of their ranking with other rights, because the rights that are considered most important are written directly into the charter. And because the property rights were deliberately pulled out, that diminishes the property rights that we have in terms of our relationship with the Constitution.
There's a man named John Locke, a historian and political theorist, he's called. He believed that people needed the right to life, liberty, and property. Why is property so important?
Well, all three of those are important in the sense that they all put restrictions on government power. Like, because we have a right to life, the government cannot, kill us. Because we have the right to liberty, the government cannot capture us and put us in prison without just cause. And because we have the right to property, the government can't take what's ours. So the right to life, liberty, and property are protections of individuals from the government. So when you remove any one of those protections, you're expanding the power of the state over the control of the individual. So that's exactly what happened with Pierre Trudeau, with his charter removing property rights. It removed some of the restriction on government power over individuals.
You indicate that one of the reasons that property rights were taken out is because of the NDP. The NDP didn't want it there, so Pierre Trudeau was happy to leave it out.
Right. Like the original proposal at some point, this took several years for all of this, from the time that Pierre Trudeau first proposed the Charter of Rights till the time that they were finally negotiating it to put in the Constitution was several years. And one of the proposals did include property rights, but the New Democratic Party said that they would not support the new Constitution unless Pierre Trudeau removed property rights. And he was happy to do so. Mm-hmm. And we say that because we know he would not have removed other rights. He wouldn't have removed language rights or other aspects of the Charter of Rights. So he would not have removed those, but he was happy to remove property rights. And that was reflected his political left-wing bias, that he wasn't a strong supporter of property rights. The Progressive Conservative Party wanted property rights to be in there, and other organizations, business organizations and things like that. But Pierre Trudeau was happy to remove it, and he could say, well, he did that in order to win support from the NDP for his constitutional proposals. And of course, the NDP did support his constitutional proposals, and they didn't include property rights.
Explain the phrase, the West wants in.
Well, the West wants in was basically the slogan of the Reform Party when it was formed in 1987. Okay. So I really like that phrase, the West wants in, because it really reflects what Western Canadians have wanted from the beginning. Like when we look back at the history of the discontent with Canada on the prairies, a lot of it has been, we want our voices heard in the national government. Why won't they listen to us? They're ignoring us. The policies they bring in ignore our interests, ignore what's best for us.
Yes.
We want our voice heard in the national government. And that was what the Reform Party was all about in the beginning.
Okay.
The Reform Party being formed in 1987, that's shortly after the first few years of the Alberta separatist movement, the Western separatist movement. Preston Manning himself, one of the reasons he formed the Reform Party, this is one, like not a major one, but he said he wanted to absorb the energy of the separatist movement and put it into a political movement that would actually build Canada rather than break it apart. And so part of the Reform Party's mandate was actually to absorb those people, and it did.
That's understandable.
Yeah, because like one of their members of parliament was Jack Ramsey. He had been leader of the Alberta Western Canada Concept Party in the mid-1980s.
Sure.
But they were able to win him over, and they won over just about everybody who had been in the separatist movement. Here was a credible political movement that was going to send members of parliament to Canada's parliament and say, we want our voice heard within the national government. Stop ignoring us. So it was a great idea. And that phrase that you mentioned, the West wants in, that represented the heart cry of Western Canadians. And I still think it does, even today, but they don't want us in. And that's the message of the Reform Party. We sent dozens of members of parliament to Ottawa throughout the 1990s to represent our voices in Ottawa, and they didn't want to hear our voice. They just considered the Reform Party to be some radical Western movement, and they would not listen. They would not reform the Senate. They would not, make any of the reforms that the Reform Party wanted in. So I say the message of the Reform Party was a very important movement. It was the right thing to do at the right time, and what it taught us was the East does not want us in. The West wants in, and they don't want us in, and so we need to get out. If they are not going to let us in, there's no use us being subservient to them and just allowing them to use us. We might as well form our own country where we can elect leaders who will do what's best for us.
Are you literally saying that even today, in 2025, the East does not want the West in?
Yes, in terms of our voice in the national government, that's exactly what I believe, because I believe we've tried so hard to reform national institutions so that our voice could be heard. Like the way it is right now, because of the population concentration in Ontario and Quebec decide the federal government, literally. Yeah. And so the people that we vote for don't necessarily make a difference in the national government. So our voice in that sense doesn't get heard. And that's the beauty of this Triple E Senate proposal, the Senate reform proposals. If we had a Senate with equal numbers of senators from each province, then our voice could be heard in the national government. And that's why that proposal was so important to the Reform Party, because that was the major way of reforming our institutions so that every province would have an equal voice in the Senate, rather than the way we have it right now, where first of all, senators are appointed, not elected, so they don't actually represent anybody, except they represent the Prime Minister who appoints them.
Sure.
And the number of senators from each province is not equal per province. It's actually very out of sync, so that provinces in the Maritimes have more senators than we have in Alberta, and Ontario and Quebec together have enough to dominate the Senate as it is. So the Senate does not work as a body, as a regional representation. It doesn't offer regional representation like it should have. The Triple E Senate would offer that and would give the West then a voice in the national government, and it's been rejected. That's one of the major factors, as to how one of the major factors to see that Canada cannot be reformed, because the Triple E Senate idea is so good, and yet it gets rejected and is not taken seriously.
You talk about Alberta's unique culture, even though you might not put it in those words. And what song came to my mind was One of these things is not like the other. One of these things is not the same. And you've had a number of children. I'm sure you know that comes from Sesame Street. Would you say that Alberta is not like the other provinces?
To some degree, we're more similar with the other prairie provinces than with the others, but we do have some distinct aspects to our culture and history. I write about this more actually in my book, No Other Option. I have a chapter on this because Alberta's history does start a little bit different. I mentioned earlier about American immigration onto the prairies that was most pronounced in Alberta. So then the early 20th century, approximately 20% of Alberta's population was American-born. That's how significant that American influence was. Then when oil was discovered, a lot of American oil men came up. Canada didn't have much of an oil industry, didn't have the expertise and the financing available. So we got a lot of Americans coming up from Oklahoma and Texas who came to Calgary to help run oil companies. And they were actually very conservative politically in many cases. Then, in the post-World War II period, we had a lot of immigration from Holland. A lot of conservative Dutch people moved here. Also, with the Soviet Union moving into Eastern Europe, we ended up, with Eastern European refugees who were opposed to communism.
Like myself.
Right. So with these waves of immigration, this is just one aspect of it.
Sure.
These waves of immigration of conservative-minded people helped to keep Alberta's political culture more conservative than much of the rest of the country. And we know that by looking at federal election returns. Alberta has voted for right-wing parties, so to speak, for decades and decades consistently. Whereas, other parts of the country that will vote one way one time and one way another, Alberta's consistently, right now it's the Conservative Party of Canada. Before that was a Canadian Alliance. Before that it was a Reform Party. Before that it was a Progressive Conservative Party. Before that it was a Social Credit. So we have a long line of, what we'd call right-wing political parties dominating our province every year. Election after election, and we're distinctive in that way. That's one way of reflecting that distinctiveness, that we have a more conservative political culture. And, we've also had more, Alberta has more ranching than many of the other, probably than any of the other provinces. And of course, the oil industry affects our outlook. And the fact that we have elected alternative parties in many cases, the fact that we had the Social Credit Party in power from 1935 to 1971 makes Alberta very different from the other provinces, especially when you consider that from 1935 until 1968, the Premier was also a radio preacher at the same time.
Yes, he was. I remember that.
That was so unique to Alberta.
Yes.
Social Credit had some success in BC, but it had a different, that political party with the same name had some different historical connotations to it. It wasn't the pure Social Credit the way Alberta started, but still Alberta was very distinctive in terms of Social Credit and how Social Credit would would help to shape our political culture, made us different, at least so much during the 20th century. In fact, I don't remember if I mentioned last time that in the 1950s, the University of Toronto Press published a 10-volume series of books to explain Alberta to the rest of Canada.
Wow.
One was on religion, some of them were on social credit, politics, and I can't remember what they all were, but I think that's totally unique that they'd feel they have to publish 10 volumes to explain one province to the rest of Canada. I think that helps to show how distinctive Alberta was to the rest of the country.
And still so.
Yes.
Now, you indicate that one of our core belief systems, Alberta's core belief, political thoughts, is we believe in small government and low taxes. Is that part of what you perceive conservatism to be?
Yeah, I think that's an important part of basic conservatism across the English-speaking world, is to believe in limited government and lower taxes. Because limited government means the government has less power over individuals, to make the decisions. The bigger the government gets, the more it's controlling what people can do, and the smaller it gets, the more it allows people to make decisions for themselves. So I think Albertans, generally speaking, these things change over time, and so we have more support for the NDP now than we did, of course, in previous generations. So this is starting to erode a little bit. But historically, Albertans have been supportive of limited government to give maximum freedom, and part of that too is lower taxes, because if the government's smaller, it needs less revenue to do its operations. And also, by having lower taxes, it leaves more money in the pockets of people, and especially in the pockets of people who can create businesses and create jobs that benefit other people and lead to economic expansion. So those are two key elements of conservatism in the English-speaking world in general, and they certainly historically have been strongly supported in Alberta.
Can you explain, as it relates to Alberta, the term Western alienation?
Yeah, Western alienation is kind of a grab bag idea of the discontent in the West, especially in the prairies, towards Eastern Canada. So there's kind of a positive side to it and a negative side to it. The positive side to it is just that it's a recognition of the fact that many people in the West are unhappy with how they're treated in relation to the federal government and the rest of the country. So when the federal government does stuff against us and we complain about that, it's often classified as being Western alienation. But there are a couple of academics in Calgary, at the University of Calgary, who have expressed concerns about that terminology, because it's a way of explaining the West in terms of the East, in terms of, the Eastern Canada is kind of the norm, and we're alienated from the norm. Like we don't match up to the norm. We don't fit their description that they would have us to be. Like it's kind of a way of demeaning the West, actually.
Gotcha.
They say that they use the term Western alienation as a way of demeaning us, as if we have some kind of psychological problem that needs to be dealt with. It's not that the country has a problem that, they need to make changes to accommodate us. It says that it's our problem. We're not taking things properly and looking at things the way they would have us to look at.
Sure.
So Western alienation goes back several decades in terms of a way of explaining why the West is unhappy. But there are reasons to be concerned about it as a phrase, because it does seem to demean us, as rather than reflecting the real concerns we have and the real justifications we have for our failure to, or our unwillingness to accept what the federal government does to us.
You talk about a bonding that has occurred in Alberta and the Western provinces, but we're talking about Alberta here. And that's a bonding against a common enemy, being the East. Can you just articulate that a little bit for us?
Sure. Like right from the very beginning of the Prairie's relationship with the federal government, we've had all these kind of concerns we've talked about. Particularly in Alberta, we've had concerns with how we've been treated by the federal government. And it's something that most Albertans share. Most Albertans share this concern with our relationship with the federal government and how the federal government has mistreated us. So it's something that we all have in common.
Yes.
It's something that bonds us together, that we as Albertans understand, why we need to stand up for our province. And so it's led to kind of a cohesion among most Albertans. Yes. And actually that explains part of the success of Peter Lougheed, as we talked about earlier. Peter Lougheed won so many elections with very high percentages of the vote, like even into the 60% sometimes, because there was this bonding among Albertans that we knew we had a common opponent, and that was the federal government. And we knew we could come together to support a particular political leader who would defend us against the federal government. And that's kind of the role that Peter Lougheed took. So that represents the bonding. We have this common understanding of a common enemy. And as Albertans, we need to fight that common enemy by electing people who will represent us and defend us against the federal government.
One thing I got out of your book is that there's a 3-part sequence here. There's mistreatment from the West, a common bonding against the enemy, which, amongst other features, has helped create a regional identity. So the regional identity, as far as a unique culture in Alberta and the West, has occurred specifically and directly because of the way Alberta has been treated since the beginning of Confederation. What would your response to that be?
Actually, I think you put that very, very well. I think that explains it really simply for people. We've been mistreated as a group. And so we, as a group of people in the prairies, and especially in Alberta, we have this common perception of being under attack from the federal government.
Yes.
And that helps us to bond together and in our understanding of what Canada is and what it's been doing to us. And so that creates a unique identity among us, that we are these people who have been mistreated, and we have this common interest that needs to be defended against the federal government. And yeah, like you say, that it's a bonding, a kind of identity that brings us together as Albertans, that separates us, sets us apart from the rest of Canada.
Yes, and so time and time again, we have been handed a lot of screws. Is there anything else that you'd like to convey in this book or elsewhere on Alberta Unfiltered? Would you like to talk to us about anything else at all?
Well, I just want to say, as an overall perspective, Canada has been a great country in the past. Like, I understand why people love Canada. Like, in the first 100 years of our history, there's so much to be proud of about Canada. But we're not the same country that we were before. So we can look at the past and value this country that was, but it's not that country anymore. Pierre Trudeau in particular brought significant changes and made it into a different country. And Westerners have tried to reform that new country so that we can fit within it and be respected within it and be treated equally within it. And the federal government and Eastern Canada does not want to treat us that way. And so now with this different country and this mistreatment we've received, an inability to make any kind of reforms, now is the time for Alberta to have a referendum on independence and become an independent country.
Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure You've taught me so much in a very short period of time, and I'm sure all of Alberta will be forever grateful to you, Dr. Michael Wagner. If you have appreciated what you've heard on Alberta Unfiltered, please like and subscribe, and thank you for listening.
From the mountains to the prairie sky.